Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory, an Orken ritual combat. Snarga was the king who, in the year 20 of the Common Reckoning, led the Orcs to Halfland. 2 years later, he was challenged to a ritual combat by an Orc named Grutter. The motivation for this seems simply to have been Grutter's resentment of his subservient position. This combat is notable, as it is the first record we have of Orcs using bills in combat. Indeed, it appears that this weapon may have been developed by Grutter. It is certain that prior to this date, we have no record of Orcs using any weapon longer than a two-handed axe, similar to a Dane-axe, and it seems that most Orcs fought with a sword or one-handed axe and a shield. As it was Grutter who issued the challenge, Snarga had the choice as to whether to fight a single or group combat. He chose a group combat, presumably because he had a greater number of slaves than Grutter. It may also be that he had a particular dislike of Grutter and wanted to be sure that Grutter fought in person. A single combat would have allowed Grutter to nominate a slave to fight Snarga in his place. As was required by custom, the combat took place in a defined area, in this case a field, bounded by dry stone walls. No combatant was permitted to leave this field until one of the two slave masters was slain or conceded the fight. Grutter was armed with sword and shield, at the head of 12 of his slaves, who were armed with bills. Snarga brought 12 slaves armed with sword or axe and shield, and his personal bodyguard of 4 slaves, who each, like their master, wielded a two-handed axe. All of the Orcs in the combat were armoured. As a result of their culture of violence, Orcs very well understood the protective effectiveness of armour. Only in extremis would a slave master put a valuable asset at risk by asking a slave to fight without armour, and a slave master who did not himself fight in armour could not expect to remain a slave master for very long. Despite Orcs' reputation as technologically crude and backward, Orc-made armour was of relatively high quality and advanced construction, in many ways resembling Roman lorica segmentata. Slaves skilled in armour making were in high demand, and usually treated well. The protagonists and their followers lined up at opposite ends of the enclosure. Snarga, flanked by his bodyguard, stood at the front of his retinue. Grutter arranged his slaves in 2 ranks and stood behind them. It seems clear from all the surviving accounts of the combat that Snarga and his bodyguard made the first move, advancing directly towards Grutter and his slaves. A late history claims that Grutter had design on Snarga's wife, designs that Snarga resented, and that Snarga's animosity and anger caused him to charge recklessly forward, intent only on coming to blows with Grutter. But, in fact, it seems more likely that Snarga's advance simply reflected typical Orken practice of closing with an opponent and exchanging blows as quickly as possible. On Snarga's left, another group of his slaves also moved forward, but the majority lagged behind. Grutter responded by ordering the first rank of his Orcs to advance, and they lowered their bills and did so. Confronted with this novel weapon, it seems that Snarga and his bodyguard halted, although his slaves on his left continued to advance. Observing this, Grutter ordered 3 of his Orcs from his second rank forward to counter the threat, and Snarga's left flank also came to a halt. Meanwhile, Snarga had been shouting at his remaining slaves to also move forward, and a group of his slaves therefore moved up on his right. Grutter ordered his remaining Orcs forward, to counter them. Apart from a group of Snarga's men who were lagging behind, the two forces were now strung across the field in two lines, facing each other. Grutter moved up closer to the line of his orcs and ordered them forward to close with the enemy. First contact was made by the orcs on Grutter's left, who charged into the group of 4 of Snarga's orcs that was facing them. The additional reach of the bills wielded by Grutter's orcs meant that Snarga's orcs were unable to get close enough to strike at them. 3 of Snarga's orcs fell back in confusion. Grutter's orcs had less success on his right flank, where Snarga's orcs sidestepped the line of bills advancing towards them, surrounding and mobbing the orc at the extreme right of Grutter's line. This orc fought bravely, but was unable to keep all 4 of his assailants at bay. He did manage to turn, and with a well-directed thrust of his bill, sent one of the orcs who had got behind him staggering out of the melee. However, his remaining 3 assailants were able to close with him, and he was cut down. But Grutter's orcs on his left flank evened the score, killing the solitary orc that had remained to face them. At this point, Grutter's centre charged into Snarga and his bodyguard. Although one of Grutter's orcs was felled by a blow from a 2-handed axe, the orcs on either side of Snarga were driven back, leaving him isolated, and 2 of Grutter's orcs brutally hacked him to death with their bills. And thus ended the combat, and thus ended the reign of Snarga the Seafarer. Such ritual combats were a popular source of entertainment, and it seems that many of the spectators were impressed by the effectiveness of the bills wielded by Grutter's slaves. From this time forward, we see the widespread use of bills by orcs in combat.